Welcome, welcome, welcome. Part of our continuing series where we talk to professors on the left, on the right, on the East Coast, on the West Coast, in the middle, and the South. Anybody who has a unique perspective, we want to bring it to you unedited and unaltered about political polarization so that you could watch all these interviews and do something that was very popular when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it will come back. Maybe it won't. Who knows? With us today, I'm going to take an attempt at that. Fathali Moghaddam is our professor. He's a cognitive science professor at Georgetown University. He's the professor of Department of Psychology, and he's also the editor at Cambridge University Press in the Progressive Psychology book series. He's written The Psychology of Revolution, How Psychologists Failed, The Future of Democracy and Dictatorship, also known as Political Plasticity, Contemporary Imagination, Psychological Perspectives to Address Challenges and Inform Solutions, Shakespeare and Experimental Psychologist, Threat to Democracy, The Appeal of Authoritarianism in an Age of Uncertainty, Mutual Radicalization, How Groups and Nations Drive Each Other to Extremes, The Psychology of Radical Change, From Rage to Revolution, the Sage Encyclopedia of Political Behavior, Scientific Explorations of Causes and Consequences Across Social Contexts, The Psychology of Democracy, and many others. The Psychology of Dictatorship. He has the Lifetime Achievement Award in 2007, the Society for the Study of Peace, Conflict, and Violence by the American Psychological Association. He also won the Outstanding International Psychologist Award 2012, also by the APA. He also won the Harold Laswell Award for the International Society of Political Psychology, given to scholars who have amassed a lifetime of achievement in interdisciplinary work that informs both political scientists and psychologists around the world. He also won the Career Research Achievement Award at Georgetown University in 2020. And this is the article where I found the professor. But before we get to that, let's check in. Professor, did I say anything wrong? Is there anything I said incorrect about your background or your research, sir?
No, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you and an honor, and everything was correct.
Okay. I'm also going to try something. Is it deuced? Is a way of saying hello? I had some Iranian Persian friends, and they taught me to say deuced or doused or deuced. I don't know if I'm doing it right. I'm trying.
No, we often say salam.
Oh, salam.
Yes.
Salam. Well, let's get right into it, Professor. In this article, it came out recently by the American Psychological Association, Healing the Political Divide. How did we become such a divided nation? And how can psychologists help us bridge the gap? Here you are. Leaders can be very effective at creating and strengthening mutual radicalization, says the professor, using a term he coined to describe the growth of two opposing sides towards more and more extreme stances. Moghaddam, a professor and director of the Interdisciplinary Program in Cognitive Science at Georgetown University and author of the book Mutual Radicalization, says that it's important to also recognize that certain forms of leadership foment and thrive on extreme polarization. If that kind of leadership wins out, then you're going to have further mutual radicalization and further polarization and further irrationality in society. Professor, what is this article about? And what were you trying to say? And I'm not trying to overload it, but why was this a good article to be part of? Why was it written now? Why did you think it was an interesting thing to be part of? And what were you trying to say?
Thank you for the questions. This article was a survey of different perspectives on the political divide in the United States. And actually, it could have gone on to talk about the political divide in Europe as well, because that is there.
Okay.
And I think I'm very eager to participate in these kinds of discussions because we do have enormous problems. And I've tried to summarize some of these problems under the term mutual radicalization. This involves groups and nations pushing each other to become more and more extreme. And it involves domestic groups such as political parties. At the moment, we have radical factions in American politics pushing each group, the other side, to become more extreme. And of course, what gets ignored and overwhelmed is the middle ground, the moderates, the majority. And unfortunately, exactly the same thing has happened in the Middle East. Exactly the same thing has happened, and extremes on the Islamic side, extremes in Israel are pushing one another to extremes.
Thank you.
And once again, the middle ground is losing out. Most people are more moderate than the extremes. And we have a situation where radicals are creating the conflict and driving the conflict, and the people who are suffering are in the middle.
My biological father taught me something. It was a phrase: "When the elephants fight, the grass loses."
Yes, that's a very good way of putting it. I think that extremists are the elephants, not in the sense that they are the most numerous or the largest, but in the sense that they make the most noise and they push the hardest, and they're willing to take extreme measures. They're willing to kill and have people killed in the name of their ideology. So that's where we are at the moment. And it's a very dangerous moment because, of course, what suffers is rationality and democracy. Democracy is weakened in the United States and in many parts of the world, and it's through this mutual radicalization process.
I'd thought about that. Let me ask you a few questions, and if you could tell me if I'm getting this right. So we can't just say one side's bad. One side acts, and then the other side reacts, and then the other side reacts, right? Isaac Newton: for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So what you're saying is you have a dynamic where there's two sides. I'm going to try to one-up you. And actually, Professor, could you give me like 10 seconds to take care of an audio problem? 10
Yes,
seconds.
of course.
I'll be right back. Sorry. Okay, apologies about that. So you have, because in America, what I often see is a discussion of, well, the radicalization is only the problem on the right. It's all the Republicans' fault. They stormed the Capitol. They alone are the problem. And when I was doing the research on political polarization, it seemed to be, well, that's not exactly the case. Maybe the Republicans are more extreme, depending on how you say it. But this idea that the Democrats have done nothing and that the two aren't feeding off of each other and encouraging each other to become more radical is incorrect. Is there something to that the Democratic and Republican parties encourage more radicalism of each other in kind of this feed-off state? I think you were pointing to Israel and Palestine. I know Hamas is a duly elected government, but they're a little bit extreme, I think, compared to maybe the people. And then in the Israeli government, you have, I believe, hard-right religious coalition that's backing Netanyahu. I think that's what you were getting at, is that there's regular Palestinians and there's regular Israelis, and then there's the people who govern them, who may be way more radicalized than what the actual people are preferring themselves. Is that right?
Well, I would put it another way.
Please.
First of all, radicalization never takes place in a vacuum. Radicalization, whether it's by an individual or group or nation, always takes place in reaction to other people, other groups, other nations. So it's not in a vacuum. And in the context of the Middle East, the radicalization I would point to, or the mutual radicalization, is actually between hardliners in Iran and hardliners in Israel.
Mm.
I see Hamas as one component of the hardline action in Iran, the others being Hezbollah, the Houthis, etc., etc. So I don't see much benefit at looking at what Hamas is doing, because what Hamas is doing is really an extension of what's happening by the mullahs in Iran.
Okay.
And they own this, they know it, and they have claimed it. And they a number of other groups around the Middle East. And the mutual radicalization taking place in the Middle East is between extremists in Iran and extremists in Israel. And they're pushing one another to more and more extreme positions. And of course, the people losing out are the vast majority in Iran and the vast majority in Israel, as well as many other populations in the Middle East. I mean, if you're a moderate in Lebanon, you are suffering because of all kinds of extremism being encouraged by outside groups.
I saw an interview with some Palestinian Christians, and it seemed to be a similar story. You know, they didn't want, they're Palestinian, but they're Christians, so they're not exactly heralded so much by Hamas, but at the same time, they're also not interested in fighting war. So I think what you're saying is we have religious extremists in the Israeli government who are Jewish, and then we have religious extremists in the Iranian government who are Persian, and they're both not moderate. They're both not really representing the moderate factions of their people. They're moderate factions of anybody on both sides, and they have their populations captive by them. And
Yeah.
these governments are forcing these countries to go and fight. When really, if you talk to the average Israeli on the street and the average Iranian on the street, they're going to be mostly concerned about coming home, feeding their kids, making sure they paid taxes. They're not really thinking about, well, let's have a Middle East war and realign, the power structure. Is that roughly what you're getting at, sir?
Yes, exactly. And the mistake being made by many people in the United States is to focus on the fighting as if it's taking place in Gaza. No, it's taking place in a much larger context. This is where we have to go back to the Gestalt motto: the whole is more than the sum of its parts. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. By looking at the parts, we're not going to get very far. We have to look at the whole. And the whole picture is being driven by extremism in Iran and Israel. And we're not going to get an accurate picture if we just focus on what's going on in Gaza.
You're saying let's get to the actual agents who are driving this conflict, the actual decision maker, the actual people who are pushing this. Hamas is certainly a player, but they're not the impetus. They're not the people controlling the playboard behind the scenes.
Exactly. Yes, they're just one of the agents being moved around by the extremists.
Okay. And unfortunately, Professor, it sounds like you're saying you see parallels between that conflict, which is very dangerous, and the conflict we have here in America. Is that fair?
Yes. In the United States, the middle ground, the majority of the people are taken hostage, basically, by extremism. And what is the psychological driving force in this is different types of threats. and perceived threats. That's why it's psychological. It's subjective threats. And of course, immigrants and whether they're legal or illegal are part of that threat. And on the one side, we have this tremendous emphasis on, the threat of immigrants and what's coming and the dangers involved. That's part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
On the other side, I think the left is making a huge mistake by taking a relativist position, and relativism is a danger for minorities, because when you have a situation where you say, well, there are no general principles we're going to follow because each culture is its own value system, and you can only assess people according to the value system of this culture or that culture.
Mm,
When
yeah.
you adopt that perspective, what happens is minorities actually suffer, because in a relativist world, it's the people with the greatest power that actually win out. They get everything. This is another topic we're getting into. I mean, it's the whole issue of how to manage diversity. I happen to believe that instead of celebrating differences, we should be celebrating similarities, because human beings are much more similar to one another than they are different.
That's globally. Yeah, absolutely. I've seen that again.
So what I would like to see is basic principles like human rights. Everybody has the right to these basic things that we have to have. And it's a human right. It's not a right for whites or blacks or Latinos or this group or that group. It's a human right. And it's not for women or men, it's for everybody. And so what I'd like to see is more of an emphasis on what I call omniculturalism meaning for all, and less of an emphasis on, hey, you're different from me and I'm different from you, and these are, we've got to celebrate our differences. I think that's a big mistake for minorities. Minorities don't come out well in this. Now, I will admit that elites among minorities can come out well if you celebrate differences, but that's only a small number of very rich elites.
The ethnic entrepreneur, I think, is a term used in sociology.
Yes, the successful one.
Yeah, the successful ethnic entrepreneur. Right. Okay.
Exactly. And they have to be very, very rich to become, to benefit from this system.
Interesting. I know in California, we're all about celebrating a vast variety of cultural differences, but we seem to also have some California values that are ubiquitous, and we expect everybody to follow along. I wanted to ask you, though, okay, immigration, minorities, sure. But when we're looking at America, I look at television, I see mostly Caucasian people who are leading the Democratic Party and mostly Caucasian people who are leading the Republican Party. That's not an ethnic or cultural or immigration issue. These are white people on white people who have been here for generations, and they have the highest level of hate and disgust at each other since right before the Civil War. According, I'm not making that up. That's according to different studies. So, how do white people who conceivably have a similar culture hate each other so much and split into these radicalized groups to the point that it's getting to the equivalent amount of hatred and vitriol as we see between Iran and Israel? I mean, I get Iran and Israel, two different countries, two different peoples, goes way back. And then you have, a lot of warfare going back to the 70s. We didn't have any of that in America. And yet we got this country going after each other just as hardcore. How did we get there? How did we get from a common culture being split into two radical opposing groups who are causing mutual radicalization of each other, in your opinion? But and if before you answer, if you could answer both as a professor and as an American, somebody who's been here for a while, what do you see professionally, and then what do you just see in your heart, like with two eyeballs and a thinking brain, having lived here for a while?
Well, that's a great question, and I'd like to answer it in two ways. There's two aspects of it. The first one is, you mentioned that there aren't sufficient people of different backgrounds, ethnicities in these two parties at the top level. And I just say we need to be careful about the kind of representation we're looking for. Let me give you an example. If you look at the cabinet of the British government at the moment, the UK government, you see Rishi Sunak
Yeah.
and quite a few others who look different. Okay, they look different, phenotype different. But I would say that's a difference that may not be that important in this case. Why? What is common to these people? What is common is that the cabinet is basically the same kinds of backgrounds. Rishi Sunak went to the same exclusive schools as
There it is.
Cameron, etc. Rishi Sunak happens to be extraordinarily rich. His wife is even richer. These are extraordinarily rich people. And in that sense, they're no different from Cameron or any others who've been at the top of the rosters of power in the UK. So at one level, I would say when we look at the top echelons of politics, we need to be careful and not take these symbolic differences and say, oh, well, they are different because their skin color is different, or they've got different,
Right.
you know, I mean,
Right.
there are certain things that we need to look out for. To what extent do these people actually represent the interests of the middle class and the lower class, the poorer people? To what extent are they actually doing things that benefit ordinary people as opposed to the people who own $100 million yachts?
Right.
So that's
Right.
one concern I have. The other concern is in making up government policies, again, I would focus on similarities, not differences and divisions. I am concerned that at the moment, there are factions within the Democratic Party and the Republican Party who seem to be outlandishly different from the middle ground.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's the problem I see. And they're driving each other through this mutual radicalization process. They're driving each other to more and more extreme positions.
Extremists on both sides not representing.
Yeah. So my gut feeling is that we need more people from the middle ground in power.
How do we get to this point? How do we get to where, I mean, because I remember the 1990s. I'm 47. I remember the 1990s, and I remember Ronald Reagan, and Reagan was very much a politician, and he would make fun of the Democrats and criticize them, but he'd also make legislation with them. And now we just seem to have criticism and no legislation. In fact, we have the least productive Congress in American history, going back, I think, like 50 or 70 years. That's a fact. And then it's been ubiquitous year after year. So how did we get to this point? If we had a level of unity, certainly amongst the elites and the general American population and mainstream Caucasian people, how did we get to where they're so divided and these extremists are representing us, just like the Israeli Iran dynamic, as we talked about before?
Yes, you're absolutely right. It's exactly the same dynamic. The dynamic is one of mutual radicalization, and there are steps that I've outlined in the book how we get to these ridiculous situations where the middle ground, the moderate people, the majority are basically ignored, and the fighting takes over everybody's lives. The way we get there is what I call collective irrationality. And collective irrationality is a process where the individual can be very bright and rational, but the individual is overtaken and overpowered by the collective movement of irrationality.
Mm.
Let me give you an example. You remember, as we all do, that during COVID, there were shortages of certain goods in the shops, like
Oh yeah,
toilet
toilet
paper,
paper.
etc.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Ugh.
Do you remember talking to people about this? And you talk to your neighbor, and you both agree, yeah, this is really idiotic, isn't it? People rushing out and buying these things. Individually, we could agree as rational creatures that this is wrong. But what happened was we got overwhelmed by the collective irrationality, and we became one of the ones who rushed to the shops and bought more Kleenexes than we needed. And we would get a phone call while we are in the shop from a friend or a relative, and they'd say, "Oh, buy one for me as well. If there's one on the shelf, grab one for me." And
Yeah.
they would be piling it up, and we all did the same.
Yeah.
See, that's a process where the individual can be bright and rational, but can become overwhelmed by the collective process. And that's what's happening with us in politics as well.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. That makes a lot of sense. I saw my mom and my sister-in-law both do the same thing. They would say, "This is ridiculous that everybody's going after toilet paper." And then they'd go do the same thing because they were concerned about losing toilet paper. So they would say this is dumb, and then they'd go out and participate in it. And I saw them both do that, and they were kind of aware of it, but they still did it anyway. So it's the collective irrationality, just like you're talking about, right during COVID. Absolutely, literally saw that.
We all did this. We all fell into the same trap. And the consequences was bare shelves in shops.
Right, right. For the first time, I think ever since maybe I don't know the 30s or something. You have to go way back. Bare shelves in shops was something that Americans were used to seeing in pictures of the old Soviet Union. It's not
Yes.
something they'd had ever seen in America. I remember people were like, "I've never seen this before." Like I don't. Maybe they saw old pictures from the 20s and 30s, but yeah.
Yes.
So we and that happened relatively quickly, right? So you went.
Exactly. Exactly.
There wasn't a long time period to acculture people to COVID thinking. I mean, we were told 2 weeks, and then suddenly it was 6 months, and then it was 1 year, and we found ourselves into it. So within half a year to a year's time frame, we moved the entire population into collective irrationality. Would that be a fair summary?
Exactly. Yes.
Wow. Huh. So it can move quick.
It can move quickly, and the challenge is how to get out of it. We got out of that thinking when we got out of COVID, but we're stuck in this process in our political system. And to jolt us out of it, we need leadership. We need leadership.
What would leadership do? What would because I remember when Marjorie Taylor Greene, the sitting Congress member, said we need a national divorce because red and blue can't live with each other anymore. And she was laughed at. And then there was a Utah governor who came out and said, "Oh, Marjorie, we don't need a national divorce. We need national marriage counseling." But
Yes.
they never defined that. What does national marriage counseling look like? What are these leaders supposed to do? Can you describe what a leader on the left and a leader on the right should be doing right now to end this collective irrationality, Professor?
Yes, in the last chapter of my book on mutual radicalization, I have discussed the path out of this process as a solution. And the first step, which is probably the most difficult step, actually, it sounds very simple, is to get people to sit together. At the moment, that in itself is difficult, to sit together and to come to a common understanding of where we are, a common understanding of where we are. And of course, to do this, you don't throw in the most radical people. You don't say, who are the most radical on the left? Who are the most radical on the right? Let's put them together. No, you bring in moderates from the middle and you have them communicate and you work outwards. So the radicals are the last people you call into this process. You have you drive the process along through moderates, not radicals. See, at the moment, what's happening in our political system is that the radicals are driving the process, not the moderates.
Right. Okay. If the solution is for us to talk and come together and find out where we are, and I completely agree, because one of the things that got me, and I've been doing research on political polarization, is that there are two sets of facts.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not really much agreement between the two sides. This side has their facts and this side has their facts.
Yes.
And I found both sides to, half of their facts are right and half of their facts are not right, but they don't care. That's their set of facts. I've seen people say, I'll PC it here, but screw your facts. They used a different word. And I remember I never heard that before the last 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I was, screw your facts. They're not my facts. They're facts. And what do you mean I don't need facts? Of course you do. They're facts. But I've seen this opinion on both sides. I don't need your facts. I don't need them. I don't need your facts.
Right.
There's no such thing as my personal facts. There's facts and then there's not true. But now we have separate sets of facts. Does that participate in creating this dynamic?
Absolutely, it does. But there are mechanisms for bringing real facts into the center of the discussion. The Congress itself has certain offices that are designed to produce facts, for example, on the budget, the Congressional Budget Office. So there are ways we have of bringing facts forward that would not be disputed by the moderates. They will be by the radicals. So there are starting points, but the starting point for the solution of mutual radicalization is to bring the moderates together to come to an agreement about where they are. And once you have agreement on where we are, then it's easier to move forward. However, you have to exclude the extremists from this process initially.
So we need the moderates from both the left and the right to come together and basically have an agreement on, these are the facts. They're not your facts. They're not my facts. We're not going to reject these facts. We're going to accept this common pool of facts as all of our facts.
Yes.
And we'll talk with each other instead of just yelling at each other. Is that?
Yes. And also agree on where we are in our relationships and accept that we have become destructive in our relationship and try to move forward towards a better place. So once we accept that we are in a destructive place, we decide to move away from that.
Yeah, except that we have become destructive in our relationships. That gets back to the two-step mutual radicalization, or the two-part. And one of the issues I've seen in America was they would say, well, I've seen a lot of mainstream news articles say this, and I've seen professors who study political polarization say this. The left did nothing wrong at all. They don't contribute to radicalization at all. All the problems are on the right. Sounds like you're saying that's not exactly a good way to get out of this. We need to have both sides recognize that they've done some destructive behaviors that they
Yes.
need to end. And we need to have the moderates from both sides reject their extremists on both sides.
Exactly. Exactly. As I said, radicalization never takes place in a vacuum. It is always in relation to some force.
Okay.
And the force is usually some radicalization taking place in another direction.
That's brilliant. I've wondered that. I've wondered that because so you have the Democrats in 2016 said that Russia hacked the election and made Donald Trump president. We found out with the Durham report and other investigations that that was not true, but it took years to find that out. Then, right after the Durham report comes out, you have the Republicans go and say, well, Joe Biden's not the legitimately elected president. And it occurred to me, okay, you have one party saying your guy's not legitimately elected, and the very next election, you have the opposite party going, well, your guy's not legitimately elected. And I go,
Yes.
they're feeding off of each other.
Yes, exactly.
But I couldn't see anyone in the mainstream media recognize that. It was, oh, when they did it, it was the right thing. When these people did it, it was the wrong. I'm like, no. They're feeding off each other. Bad ideas are feeding more bad ideas. My brother and I had this game, and it keeps occurring to me. It drove my mom mad. It was called "I'm Not Touching You," and we do this like, I didn't touch you, I didn't touch you, and then you poke them a little bit, and then they poke you a little bit, and then they poke a little bit harder, and then eventually we're just hitting each other, and that's when my mom would lose her mind. And it, but we're like, I didn't hit you that hard, you hit me harder than I hit you. Why are you guys both participating in a game where you're hitting each other? But that's the madness of it. It's not, oh, we both agree to participate in this game. It's he hit me harder, so he's the bad guy, even though
that's a very good example to use, because it's a gradual process of increasing intensity, and that's exactly what mutual radicalization is. It's gradual, it's increasingly polarized, and it leads to a situation where people are standing in ridiculous positions, but they don't recognize it.
That's insane. That's incredible. So, okay, we're winding down. How did we get here? I know there were mistakes made, but I can remember, well, not remember. I looked up videos. Reagan was very partisan. He was very much for his Republican team. Boy, he loved making jokes at Democrats. He loved saying how stupid they were. But we had a workable democracy at that time. How did we get, so I don't want to paint it as everybody's got to be nice to each other and we got to hold hands every election. Of course not. Reagan was very partisan, but we had a functional country. How did we get from that level of partisanship where he was pretty rough, but it was still functional to it's just hardcore insults now and completely dysfunctional? How did that happen? In both your professional opinion and as somebody who's lived on this continent for a while, how did we get here?
Well, it's not very difficult to slip from that functional situation to a dysfunctional mutual radicalization process once people adopt the attitude that your pain is my gain, and it doesn't matter how much I end up hurting as long as I hurt you more. So that's the attitude we've sort of adopted at the moment. And your pain, my gain leads us to lose perspective on the whole picture. We lose perspective on the benefits that should come to the whole society. We focus simply on hurting the other as much as possible, believing that as long as we hurt them, that's a gain for us.
I had heard about recent elections where, like with Trump versus Clinton or Biden versus Trump, that people weren't voting so much on who they liked, but voting against people they didn't like. So they weren't voting because they liked Hillary; they're voting because they hated Trump. Um,
Yes, yes,
and that's different, you know. And I want to hurt you. If you lose, I win. Do you even know
yeah,
what the guy you voted for or the woman you voted for is standing for? I don't know, but I know they're not you, and I know you're mad that they won, so that's a win, right?
yes, exactly. We've got into a situation of your pain, my gain, and that's not a good basis for politics at all, because it leads us to lose perspective on the benefits that should come from, could go to the whole country.
Um, so there are some people who said, well, I think it was a Utah governor race or a Nevada governor race where I think it was last year. Everything's super polarized, and these two candidates in one state did this. It wasn't because their parties told them to, it's because they decided to. So the two candidates for governor, the Republican and the Democrat, did a joint television ad.
Yes,
Yeah, with I will accept if he wins.
yes,
I don't think he should win. You should vote for me, but
yeah,
you know, because I'm better, but I will accept. And that apparently really helped to calm things down in that one state.
yes. I saw that, and it was brilliant. Um, Unfortunately, what happened immediately afterwards is radicals, extremists, made sure that that was not going to be adopted widely. They went the other way.
Right. Right.
So it's partly also a matter of the 21st century media and the fact that extremists make threats and get a lot of attention
Right.
through that.
Right. 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 I've heard that so you say something radical, you get media coverage. If you
Yeah,
get media coverage, you get donations. With donations, your party goes up. Also, the media knows that if they show a politician saying something radical, they'll get more viewers, which means they get more advertising money. So
yes,
the
yes,
media is incentivized financially to do this, and politicians are incentivized financially to do this. Given that system, I've heard that it might be impossible for moderates to come back into the power because they never say anything radical. So nobody's going to pay attention to what they say. And the media is not really going to be interested in covering them because we're now so attuned to um, radical, edgy politicians like AOC on one side
yes.
or Donald Trump on the other. How do we undo that?
Well, I think we can undo it because the middle ground, the majority of people are hungry for an alternative.
Mm,
When you talk to people around the country, you find that the moderates, the majority of people want something different. And we need charismatic leadership in the middle. We need charismatic leadership in the middle to put forward moderate proposals in a radical way. And that's possible. We know it can be done. It's just a matter of uh, gearing up for that kind of politics to come along. I'm very hopeful. I'm very optimistic that we're going to turn a corner in the next 10 years and come back to a better future for America, better political future, as well as everything else. I'm very optimistic. I'm optimistic about AI and the um, productivity that is going to benefit everybody from the increased use of AI in our everyday lives at work, etc. So I'm looking at this with optimism and believing that democracy will win out and can win out and should win out. Um, at the same time, uh, I have to say that the opposite forces the dictatorships in the world are really mobilizing, and we have to move ourselves. Democracy will not win out without us working hard for democracy. So that's what we have to do.
A lot of questions there. Okay, let's say we're going to turn a corner in the next 10 years, just like you said. But there's another January 6th, and then there's another January 6th, and then there's another Stop the Steal program, and then there's another Stop the Steal program. So before we get to this 10-year point where we've turned around, we've had 3 total January 6ths and 5 total I doubt your person won the election. Can we come back from that much damage at that point?
Well, we can come back through mobilizing the moderates, just as mutual radicalization takes place through the increasingly mutual radicalization of extremes. You can also mobilize the middle ground. And that's what we need to do next. If you mobilize the middle ground effectively, what will happen is that any second January 6th or 3rd will have minimal impact. So the impact of that event, it's not that it won't happen, but the impact will be much less. And I'm hopeful and optimistic that we can turn this around and move away from our current situation. By the way, and I kept mentioning leadership, I think one of the ways in which we can move forward is to have more moderates and more women at the top level of politics. And I think that's very important.
Sure, but when we be talking about the right kind of women, by what I mean is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a young Latina. A lot of young women look up to her. She's massively increasing polarization. I mean, she's routinely being polarizing all the time and encouraging that behavior. That would not be an example of the type of moderate leadership you're discussing. Is that fair?
It's fair. And when I said we need more moderates and women, I meant those two are linked. You know,
right. Okay.
we need more women coming through, and that is going to take place as well. But as you said, it has to be more moderate women.
Okay, so maybe like an Amy Klobuchar, who was seen as somewhat middle ground. I'm not endorsing her. I'm just saying compared to AOC or Hillary, she was seen as somewhat middle-ish ground-ish.
Well, I don't want to name people,
sure,
but
sure. I get, yeah, sure.
You know, and I use the example of Sunak in the UK.
Right.
Just because somebody looks a particular way doesn't mean that they're going to be beneficial to the majority of people.
That's true. Yeah, I won't get into it, but in Spanish we have the term vendido. It means that's store that's out of goods, sell out.
Yes.
So, yeah, you said you're for us, but are you really? You may look like us, you may talk like us, but are you really? And we've seen that before. I see that when I see Rishi Sunak. He reminds me of Alberto Gonzalez, who was the Attorney General appointed by George W. Bush. And they said, "Isn't this a great day for diversity?" And then they had Alberto Gonzalez. He got promoted because he allowed some of the worst forms of torture when we were in the Iraq War. So I was like, okay, well, that's not something I'm for. Right. Okay, so the way that we make sure that if there's another January 6th and a second and a third and another Stop the Steal and a third Stop the Steal, we can survive all of that by activating the moderates and having moderate, inspiring leaders. Is that a fair summation?
Yes. And we need moderate leaders who are charismatic and who are radically moderate, who are going to be drivers of change.
Do you have anyone you could point to right now who might be a
No,
radical
I
moderate?
tend never to name
Okay,
politicians. in
fair
these
enough. Yeah,
discussions.
fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah, because then you're talking about the individual person and if they meet that criteria or not versus the idea itself. Yeah, so we need radical moderates. Okay, winding down. Last two questions. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third party person watching this interview, and they're saying, "Wow, I learned a lot." Americans and their level of vitriol to each other, similar to what's going on in the Middle East. Wow, well, I learned a lot. Radical dynamics, people playing off each other. But there was this one thing that the professor said, and I can't get it out of my head 5 days later after watching the video. What would that one thing be that you'd want a third party person who's not you or me watching this video to not be able to get out of their head 5 days after watching this interview with you, sir?
Human beings are much more alike than they are different. We should focus on what I call omniculturalism, celebrating similarities, not differences. We should stop focusing on differences across political lines, focus on what we have in common. That's the main message. We should stop focusing on differences across ethnic lines, focus on what we have in common. It's the common ground that's important.
Yeah, that's very inspiring. You don't have to name anybody, but I hope you found this was a fair interview. We didn't do gotcha journalism. I'll send you a copy of the video. If you could think of anybody who you might be willing to recommend, who might be willing to have an honest conversation about political polarization. They could be in academia. They could be a neighbor down the street, somebody you read about, anything. We just like to keep the conversation going.
Yes, I'll send you a name.
Okay. We'll end it there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Salam.
Very interesting. Salam.
And I'll send you a video copy soon. I will appreciate
Great.
your time, Professor.
Thank you. Interesting discussion. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.